My name is Bupa. I'm 74 years old, and I need to tell you something that might frighten you. Not because it's dangerous, but because it's true. And truth, real truth, the kind that reaches into the deepest part of you and shakes the foundation of everything you believed. That kind of truth always frightens before it frees. Your mind is not your friend, not always, not in the way you think. The mind you trust, the mind you rely on to navigate your life, to make your decisions, to tell you who you are and what you're worth. That mind has been quietly, slowly, methodically controlling you. And you don't see it. You can't see it, because the one doing the controlling is the same one you'd use to try to see it. And that is the trap. That is the invisible cage most people live and die inside of without ever realizing they were imprisoned. I lived inside that cage for over 50 years. 50 years of believing every thought my mind produced. 50 years of obeying every fear it generated. 50 years of following every instruction it whispered to me as though it were absolute truth. And I never questioned it, not once. Because why would you question the voice inside your own head? It feels like you. It sounds like you. It speaks in your language, uses your memories, knows your deepest insecurities. Of course you trust it. Of course you believe it. It would be like questioning your own eyes, your own ears, your own sense of reality. And yet that is exactly what I'm asking you to do right now. Because the moment you begin to question that voice, the moment you step back far enough to see it for what it really is, everything changes. Everything. Let me take you back to where this started for me, because I didn't learn this from a book. I didn't hear it in a lecture. I learned it the way most important lessons are learned, through pain. Through years of unnecessary suffering that could have been avoided if someone had shown me what I'm about to show you. When I was younger, I was a woman consumed by worry. Not the ordinary kind of worry that comes and goes, the kind that lives inside you like a second heartbeat. Constant, relentless, always there. I worried about everything, about my children, about my health, about money, about what people thought of me, about the future, about the past, about things that hadn't happened and might never happen. My mind would take one small concern and build it into a catastrophe. It would take a single uncertain moment and spin it into 1,000 terrifying possibilities. And I believed every single one of them. I believed them because they came from inside me, and I didn't know yet that not everything that comes from inside you is true. There was a period in my life, I must have been in my early 40s, when the worry became so intense that I could barely function. I would wake up at 3 in the morning with my heart pounding and my mind racing through scenarios of disaster. What if this happens? What if that happens? What if I'm not prepared? What if I fail? What if everything falls apart? My mind would present these possibilities with such vivid detail, such convincing logic, that I would lie there in the dark, genuinely believing that my life was about to collapse. And then morning would come, and nothing had collapsed. Everything was fine. But my body had already lived through the catastrophe. My nervous system had already experienced the disaster as though it were real. And so I would start the day exhausted, drained, as though I had spent the night fighting a war that only existed inside my own head. That is what your mind does. That is what it has always done. It creates scenarios. It builds narratives. It tells stories about the past and the future that feel absolutely real, but are nothing more than thoughts. And you believe them. You react to them. You make decisions based on them. You shape your entire life around them. And most of the time, they are not true. They are projections, interpretations, distortions. Your mind takes a small piece of reality and wraps it in layers of fear and assumption until the original piece is completely buried. And then it presents the whole package to you as fact, and you accept it, because you don't know there's any other option. Here is what I wish someone had told me when I was still young enough to have saved myself decades of suffering. You are not your mind. I know that sounds strange. I know it sounds abstract. But stay with me, because this is the most important thing I will ever say to you. You are not your mind. Your mind is something you have, like a tool, like an instrument, but it is not who you are. The thoughts that move through your mind are not your identity. They are events, mental events that arise and pass away, like clouds moving across the sky. You don't look at a cloud and say, that cloud is the sky. The cloud is in the sky. It moves through the sky. But the sky remains the sky, regardless of what clouds pass through it. You are the sky. Your thoughts are the clouds. And the moment you understand that, truly understand it, not as an idea, but as a lived experience, you are free. Because you realize that you don't have to believe every thought. You don't have to follow every fear. You don't have to obey every command your mind gives you. You can simply watch, observe, notice, and let it pass. I discovered this in the most unexpected way. I was sitting alone one evening, drowning in worry as usual, when something happened that I still cannot fully explain. I was in the middle of a particularly vicious thought spiral. My mind telling me that something terrible was going to happen to my family. Building the story detail by detail, making it more vivid and more frightening with every passing second. And suddenly, for no reason I can identify, I noticed what was happening. Not from inside the spiral, from somewhere else, somewhere behind it, somewhere deeper. It was as if a part of me stepped back and watched the whole performance from a distance. And from that distance, something became very clear. The thoughts were happening, but I was not the thoughts. I was the one watching the thoughts. And the one watching was calm, completely calm, undisturbed, unafraid. The fear was in the thoughts, but the one observing the thoughts was at peace. That moment lasted only a few seconds, maybe less. And then I was pulled back into the spiral, and the fear returned, and everything felt urgent and real again. But those few seconds changed everything, because I had seen something I could not unsee. I had seen that there was a space between me and my thoughts, a tiny gap, and in that gap lived freedom. Freedom I didn't know existed. Freedom I had never tasted in over 40 years of living entirely identified with every thought my mind produced. If something in what I'm describing feels familiar to you, if you recognize yourself in this pattern of being controlled by your own thinking, then I need you to understand something very important. It is not your fault. You were never taught to see the difference between yourself and your mind. No one teaches us this. We grow up completely merged with our thinking. We believe that we are our thoughts, the way a fish believes it is the water. The fish doesn't know the water exists because it has never experienced anything else. And you don't know that your thoughts are separate from you because you have never experienced yourself without them. But that experience is possible, and it is the beginning of a completely different way of being alive. After that evening, I began to practice something very simple. I began to watch my mind. Not fight it, not control it, not try to stop thinking. Just watch. Like sitting on the bank of a river and watching the water flow past, not jumping in, not trying to redirect the current, just watching. And what I saw astonished me. I saw how my mind created suffering out of nothing. I saw how it took neutral events and painted them with fear. I saw how it constantly compared, judged, criticized, predicted, and catastrophized. I saw how it told me stories about myself that were deeply unkind. Stories about not being good enough, not being smart enough, not being lovable enough, not being worthy enough. And I saw how I had been believing those stories my entire life, without ever stopping to ask whether they were true. Do you know what happens when you start watching your thoughts instead of believing them? Something remarkable. The thoughts lose their power. Not immediately, not completely, but gradually, like turning down the volume on a radio that has been blasting at full volume your entire life. The thoughts are still there. The voice still speaks, but it no longer controls you. Because you can see it now. You can see it for what it is. Not truth, not reality, just mental activity, just noise. And noise only has power over you when you believe it's a message. When you realize it's just noise, you can let it play in the background while you live your actual life in the foreground. This is what the mind doesn't want you to see. And I say that not to make the mind into an enemy. The mind is not evil. The mind is a survival tool. It evolved to keep you alive, to scan for danger, to anticipate threats, to prepare for worst-case scenarios. And it does that job very well, too well, because in the absence of real danger, it creates imaginary danger. It gives you something to worry about, because that's its function. It keeps you in a constant state of low-level fear, because fear keeps you alert, and alert keeps you alive. But there is a difference between being alive and actually living. And most people spend their entire lives in survival mode, driven by a mind that cannot tell the difference between a real threat and an imagined one, never knowing that a different experience of life is possible. I spent years in that survival mode, years of unnecessary anxiety, years of reactions based on thoughts that had no basis in reality, years of arguments I rehearsed in my head that never happened, years of futures I feared that never arrived, years of pasts I replayed that could never be changed. All of it generated by a mind that was simply doing its job, and none of it questioned by the woman who believed she had no choice but to obey. But you do have a choice. That is what I came here to tell you today. You have a choice you don't know you have. The choice to step back, to observe, to create that tiny gap between you and your thoughts, and in that gap to find something you may have never felt before: stillness. Not the stillness of an empty mind. The mind will never be empty. Thoughts will always come. The stillness of knowing that you are not those thoughts. The stillness of watching the storm without being in the storm. The stillness of being the sky, not the clouds. I am 74 years old now. My mind still produces thoughts all day long. It still worries sometimes. It still creates stories that aren't true. It still tries to pull me into fear and regret and anticipation. That hasn't changed. What has changed is my relationship to it. I no longer obey automatically. I no longer believe every thought that appears. I listen, I observe, I notice, and then I choose. Sometimes the thought is useful and I follow it. Sometimes the thought is noise and I let it pass. That ability to choose, that tiny space between stimulus and response, between thought and action, that is the most precious thing I have ever found. More precious than any possession, more precious than any relationship, more precious than any achievement. Because without that space, you are a puppet, and your mind is pulling the strings. I want you to try something right now. Whatever thought is in your head at this moment, whatever worry or judgment or plan or fear is running through your mind, I want you to notice it. Don't fight it. Don't push it away. Just notice it. See it. Recognize it as a thought, not as truth, not as reality, just a thought, a cloud passing through the sky of your awareness. And then notice what's behind the thought. Notice the one who is watching, the one who is aware that a thought is happening. That one is you, the real you. And that one is always at peace, always still, always free, no matter what the thoughts are doing. That is what your mind doesn't want you to see. Not because it's malicious, but because the moment you see it, the mind loses its authority. And the mind has been running your life for so long that a shift in power feels threatening. Your mind will resist this. It will tell you this is nonsense. It will tell you to stop listening. It will create new thoughts to pull you back into identification. That is expected. That is normal. Let it happen. Watch that too. Watch the resistance. Watch the mind trying to reassert control. And smile. Because the fact that you can watch it means you are already free. You just didn't know it yet. My name is Bupa. I lived 74 years. More than 50 of those years were spent as a prisoner of my own thinking. A prisoner who didn't know she was in prison because the walls were invisible and the guard spoke in her own voice. And then one quiet evening, for just a few seconds, I saw through the illusion. I saw the space between me and my thoughts. And in that space, I found everything I had been searching for. Stillness, freedom, peace. Not the peace of a silent mind, the peace of a mind that can be as loud as it wants without disturbing the one who watches. That peace is inside you right now. It has always been inside you. It is closer than your next breath, closer than your next thought. It is what you are, beneath everything your mind has told you that you are. And the only thing standing between you and that peace is the belief that your thoughts are who you are. Let go of that belief, even for a moment, and feel what remains. What remains is you, the real you, and she has been waiting for you to come home for a very long time.